In March of 1847, in the cotton heart of Alabama, Eleanor Whitcombe made an announcement that even hardened plantation owners found obscene. She ordered her 2 adult sons to stop marrying, stop courting, and stop leaving the plantation grounds. Instead, she issued a ledger. Inside that ledger were names of enslaved women, dates, and expected births. Within 18 months, 27 children were born on Whitcombe land. Every single one was fathered by one of her sons. Every single one was recorded as property. White society whispered. Church elders looked away. But no one intervened. What they did not know was that Eleanor was not motivated by cruelty alone, but by fear, and by a secret buried in bloodlines that, if exposed, would destroy one of Alabama's most respected families. By 1851, 3 deaths, 1 disappearance, and a burned wing of the plantation would force authorities to quietly seal all records. What really happened inside Whitcombe House? And what did Eleanor force her sons to do that haunted them until their deaths? Backhand index pointing right before we uncover the disturbing truth. Subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. In March of 1847, the Black Belt of Alabama lay heavy under a low, gray sky, the kind that pressed down on the land like a held breath. The soil there was dark and rich, almost purple when wet, staining boots and hems and fingers alike. Men said you could drop a seed into it and watch it grow. Cotton thrived in that earth. So did cruelty. Whitcombe Plantation stretched across more than 1,200 acres of that soil, a vast, carefully ordered world that ran on ledgers, whips, and silence. From the veranda of the main house, the land rolled outward in disciplined rows, white bowls clinging to green plants like open wounds. Beyond them stood the slave quarters, weathered cabins crouched low to the ground, their chimneys smoking thinly in the morning chill. Farther still were the outbuildings, barns, and sheds, each with a purpose, each accounted for. Everything on Whitcombe land was counted. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Whitcombe. She was 46 years old that spring, tall and spare, her posture rigid as if her spine had been braced with iron. Her dresses were always dark, charcoal, brown, black, cut plainly but sewn from the finest cloth available in Montgomery. She did not favor jewelry, save for a thin gold wedding band she never removed, though her husband had been dead for nearly 6 years. Eleanor rose before dawn every morning. She took her coffee without sugar and ate little. By the time the sun crested the tree line, she was already seated at her desk in the east-facing study, pen in hand, ledger open. Numbers calmed her. Columns aligned, totals confirmed, margins preserved. Cotton yields, market prices, births, deaths, especially births. She had inherited Whitcombe Plantation in 1841, when Samuel Whitcombe collapsed in the parlor one humid August evening, clutching his chest and gasping as if the air itself had turned against him. The doctor called it a sudden failure of the heart. The neighbors nodded solemnly and brought casseroles and condolences. No one questioned how smoothly Eleanor stepped into command. She had always been the mind behind the operation. Samuel had liked to think of himself as a patriarch, a man of authority, but it was Eleanor who had kept the books, negotiated loans, and calculated expansion. She understood something many planters preferred not to articulate aloud. Land alone did not generate wealth. Labor did. And labor that reproduced itself was the most profitable of all. By 1847, Whitcombe Plantation was thriving. Cotton shipments left weekly for Mobile, then onward to New Orleans and beyond. Eleanor's name appeared frequently in correspondence among merchants and brokers, always accompanied by a quiet respect. She paid her debts on time. She expanded efficiently. She did not waste resources. People said she was cold. People said she was unfeminine. People said many things in hushed tones, usually after church, usually when they believed she was not listening. She heard everything. From the gallery, Eleanor could see the fields clearly. She watched lines of enslaved men and women move through the rows, their sacks dragging behind them, overseers riding slow circles at the perimeter. The crack of a whip carried faintly on the air, followed by no scream, no protest. Discipline on Whitcombe land was precise. Excess was inefficient. Behind her, the house was silent. Too silent, some thought, for a home with 2 grown sons. Thomas Whitcombe was 24 that year. Caleb was 22. Both lived under Eleanor's roof. Neither was married. That fact alone raised eyebrows. Eligible white women had been presented. Daughters of neighboring planters, distant cousins, respectable families with modest dowries. Eleanor had declined them all with polite finality. "Not yet," she said. "They are not ready," she said. "The timing is wrong," she said. What she did not say was that marriage complicated things. She preferred control. On that March morning, Eleanor closed her ledger and stood, moving to the tall window overlooking the drive. A carriage approached, wheels crunching over gravel. The overseer dismounted near the steps, removing his hat. He waited. Eleanor did not acknowledge him immediately. She thought instead of the figures she had calculated the night before. The cost of purchasing a healthy enslaved woman in Alabama had risen sharply. Demand was high. Supply was not. But children born on the plantation, children born into bondage, cost nothing beyond time, food, and management. She had calculated averages, risks, losses. She had prepared contingencies. What Eleanor Whitcombe understood, and what many refused to confront, was that slavery was not merely a system of force. It was a system of planning, of foresight, of inheritance. She turned from the window at last, her decision already settled. Down in the quarters, a woman named Hannah felt an unease she could not name. She paused in her work, one hand pressed briefly to her stomach, listening to the distant sound of the house bell. It rang once, then again. None of them knew what that sound truly meant. What they did not know was that, inside the main house, Eleanor Whitcombe was about to open a ledger that would alter every life on that land, white and black alike, and bind them together in ways no one would dare speak of for generations. It was the beginning. And it was not mercy that guided her hand. Eleanor had not been born cruel. That was the lie people preferred because it made monsters easier to understand. She had been born practical. She came into the world in 1801 on a tidewater plantation outside Norfolk, Virginia, the third daughter of a man who believed affection weakened authority and a mother who believed silence preserved order. From an early age, Eleanor learned to observe rather than speak, to listen rather than plead. While her sisters practiced pianoforte and embroidery, Eleanor lingered near doorways, absorbing conversations meant for men. Crop failures, slave prices, debts quietly shifted from one ledger to another. By 14, she could calculate profit margins faster than her father's overseer. By 16, she knew which enslaved women were good breeders, though the phrase made her mother flinch whenever it was spoken aloud. "It is not polite to discuss such things," her mother once said, closing the parlor door. "It is not polite to go hungry either," Eleanor replied. That earned her a slap. It also earned her respect. She married Samuel Whitcombe at 19, a match arranged not for love but for land. Samuel was older by nearly 15 years, broad-shouldered, genial in public, careless in private. He liked whiskey and cards and believed management could be delegated. Eleanor did not correct him. She simply filled the gaps he left behind. When they moved south to Alabama in the late 1820s, Eleanor recognized opportunity immediately. The Black Belt was raw then, still being carved into plantations by men drunk on promise. She watched neighbors fail because they expanded too fast, borrowed too much, trusted overseers too blindly. Eleanor did none of that. She learned the rhythms of the land. The seasons when sickness spread. The months when births clustered. The years when cotton prices dipped and rose again. She learned how to keep enslaved people alive just well enough to remain productive, how to discourage rebellion without inviting attention. Samuel thought this made her admirable. He never understood how much it frightened him. Their sons were born within 2 years of each other. Eleanor nursed them herself, a detail the women of Montgomery found unsettling. She did not dote. She observed. From the beginning, she measured them not by affection but by potential. Thomas was quiet, compliant, eager to please. Caleb was sharp-edged, curious, prone to anger. Eleanor saw both their strengths and their weaknesses early, and she cataloged them with the same precision she applied to acreage and yield. By the time Samuel died, Whitcombe Plantation was solvent but fragile. Debts lingered beneath the surface, hidden by good seasons and favorable contracts. Eleanor knew that one bad year, one failed crop, one outbreak of fever, could collapse everything. That was when she began to think differently. She did not announce her plans. She never did. She simply adjusted her methods. She delayed her son's education away from home. She refused marriage proposals. She tightened her oversight of the quarters. She began keeping a second ledger, thinner than the first, its cover unmarked. Samuel had once asked about it, half drunk, peering over her shoulder. "What is that one for?" "Contingencies," Eleanor said. He laughed and forgot the question. By 1847, Eleanor Whitcombe was widely regarded as a capable widow. Church elders praised her restraint. Merchants praised her reliability. Younger planters watched her methods closely, even as they pretended not to. None of them knew what calculations occupied her nights. In her study, Eleanor lit a lamp and reopened the unmarked ledger. Inside were names written in a careful hand. Pages. Physical notes. Medical observations. Blank spaces waited beside each entry, patient and expectant. She paused over one name longer than the others. Anna. Strong hips. Regular cycles. No recorded illness. Eleanor closed the book gently. Above her, Thomas paced his room, uneasy without understanding why. He had dreamed the same dream for 3 nights running. A child crying in the dark, a door he could not open, his mother standing behind him, counting. Down in the quarters, Hannah lay awake on her pallet, listening to the night insects sing. She thought of her mother, sold south years before. She thought of the way the house bell had sounded that morning, sharp and deliberate. None of them knew how tightly their futures had already been bound. And Eleanor Whitcombe, seated alone in lamplight, did not consider herself wicked. She considered herself prepared. Thomas Whitcombe had learned early how to disappear without leaving the room. At 24 he was tall and narrow, his father's height without his bulk, his mother's restraint without her certainty. He moved quietly through the house, stepping around loose floorboards, closing doors with care. When spoken to, he answered promptly and politely. When not addressed, he remained silent. This had earned him a reputation as a good son, a dutiful son. It had also earned him invisibility. Caleb was the opposite. He filled space. At 22, he carried himself with restless energy, shoulders always tense, jaw tight as if grinding against an unspoken argument. He laughed too loudly, drank too much, and argued with Eleanor in ways Thomas never dared. Where Thomas retreated inward, Caleb pressed outward, testing boundaries he sensed but did not fully understand. Eleanor saw them both clearly. At breakfast, she sat at the head of the long table, hands folded, eyes moving between her sons as they ate. The clink of cutlery echoed in the high-ceilinged dining room. No servants hovered nearby. Eleanor preferred privacy for family matters. "You will both remain on the plantation this spring," she said calmly. Thomas nodded automatically. Caleb looked up. "I had planned to ride into Montgomery next week." "You had planned incorrectly." Caleb's mouth tightened. "For what reason?" "For mine." Silence followed, heavy and practiced. Eleanor had always spoken this way, issuing decisions without explanation, expecting compliance as a matter of course. Thomas accepted it as gravity. Caleb resented it like a chain. "We are grown men," Caleb said finally. "We cannot live like." "You live as I allow," Eleanor replied, her tone unchanged. "As your father intended." The mention of Samuel ended the discussion. It always did. Later that morning, Eleanor summoned them to her study. The room smelled of ink and lamp oil, leather-bound volumes lining the walls. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. The desk stood between them like an altar. Eleanor gestured for them to sit. She remained standing. "I have delayed this conversation longer than was prudent," she said. "That ends today." She reached into the desk drawer and withdrew the unmarked ledger. Caleb leaned forward despite himself. Thomas's hands clenched in his lap. "This plantation," Eleanor continued, "will pass to one of you, or both if circumstances permit. But it will not survive sentimentality. Marriage introduces obligations. Wives bring opinions. Children bring distractions." "You intend for us never to marry?" Caleb asked, disbelief edging his voice. "I intend for you to do as required," Eleanor said. "Marriage can wait." "Until when?" "Until it is no longer a risk." Thomas swallowed. "Mother, what is it you are asking of us?" Eleanor opened the ledger. The pages were neat, clinical. Names written in careful ink. Measurements. Notes. Dates left blank. Caleb stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. This is vile." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Sit." He did not. "You would have us," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I would have you preserve what your father built," Eleanor said. "I would have you secure your inheritance. Nothing more." Thomas stared at the ledger, his breath shallow. He understood then fully what Eleanor had been preparing for years. Not in detail, but in intent. "This is not right," he whispered. Eleanor closed the book. "Rightness is a luxury afforded to those who can survive it." Caleb laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You cannot force us." Eleanor turned to him slowly. "I can." She spoke then of debts he did not know existed. Of loans Samuel had taken quietly. Of documents Eleanor controlled. She spoke of the law, of legitimacy, of how easily men could be ruined by rumor. "You were born into this system," she said. "You will serve it." Thomas felt something inside him fracture. He had spent his life believing obedience would protect him. In that moment, he realized obedience had only prepared him. Down in the quarters, the house bell rang again. Once, then twice. Women looked up from their work, exchanging glances. They knew that sound meant selection. It always had. Hannah felt her stomach tighten. She did not yet know why, but her body understood before her mind caught up. Above them all, Eleanor Whitcombe returned the ledger to its drawer, her decision complete. None of them knew how much blood that book would demand. But Eleanor had already counted the cost. The first night passed without incident, which unsettled Thomas more than if violence had come immediately. Dinner was served as usual. Eleanor spoke of weather patterns, of shipments delayed upriver, of a letter from Mobile regarding cotton prices. Caleb barely touched his food. Thomas ate mechanically, tasting nothing. When the meal ended, Eleanor rose, signaling dismissal. Thomas, Caleb, remain. The servants withdrew. The house settled into its nocturnal hush, the kind that magnified every footstep, every breath. Eleanor did not sit. She retrieved the unmarked ledger and placed it on the table between them. The leather cover looked unassuming, almost modest. It was the contents that carried weight. I will be clear, she said. Confusion wastes time. She opened the book to the first page. A name, an age, a short notation about health. These women have been selected, Eleanor continued. Not arbitrarily. I have accounted for strength, fertility, and temperament. There will be no indulgence. No cruelty. This is not about desire. Caleb scoffed. You dress it up with words and think it changes what it is. Eleanor met his gaze. Words are how the world survives its own actions. Thomas stared at the page. He recognized the handwriting. His mother's hand was unmistakable, precise, controlled, incapable of accident. How often? He asked quietly. Eleanor turned a page. As necessary. Caleb pushed back his chair. I will not do this. You will, Eleanor replied. Or you will leave this house with nothing but your name. And I will see to it that name carries no weight anywhere you go. Caleb's fists clenched. You would ruin your own son. I would preserve this land, Eleanor said. You are incidental. The words landed with finality. Later, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Caleb pacing in the next room, the floorboards creaking with each agitated step. Thomas wanted to speak, to say something, anything, that might slow the inevitable. But the truth pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor had planned this too long to be swayed now. Down in the quarters, the night carried a different tension. The house bell had rung earlier, summoning several women to the yard beneath the main house. They stood in a loose line, heads lowered, hands folded. Overseer Mills read names from a list, his voice flat. When he reached Hannah's name, her chest tightened. She stepped forward without protest. Protest had never saved anyone. They were not told why they had been chosen. They were never told why. Explanation implied choice. Choice implied humanity. Hannah was escorted to a small cabin near the edge of the property, one usually reserved for sick or injured hands. A lantern burned inside, casting long shadows against the walls. She noticed the fresh bedding, the clean floor. Preparation. What happened there did not require detail. It required memory. Hannah focused on the sound of her own breathing, on the rhythm of it, on the thought of surviving to morning. She did not look at the man. She did not speak his name. Names had power, and she needed to preserve what little power remained. In the main house, Eleanor sat alone at her desk, pen moving steadily. She recorded dates. She recorded compliance. She recorded outcomes. She did not write about screams. Thomas did not sleep that night. At dawn, he stood at his window and watched Hannah return to the quarters, her gait altered, her eyes fixed ahead. Something inside him recoiled, a quiet, sickened thing he did not yet have language for. Caleb left the house before sunrise. He rode hard toward the tree line, anger burning hotter than fear. He told himself he would not return. He told himself he would expose everything. By noon he was back. Eleanor waited for him on the veranda. You have made your choice, she said. Caleb dismounted slowly. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in recognition. The world beyond Whitcombe land was not prepared to hear his truth. Not from him. Not now. The ledger remained open. Weeks passed. The process repeated with grim regularity. Names were checked. Dates were marked. The quarters filled with a new kind of silence, thick and watchful. Thomas avoided the women's eyes. Caleb grew sharper, crueler, as if hardness might armor him against what he was becoming. And Eleanor Whitcombe watched it all unfold with the same expression she wore while counting cotton bolls in the field. Efficient, detached, certain. What none of them yet understood was that systems built without mercy eventually consumed their architects. The ledger was filling faster than Eleanor had projected, and consequences like births could not be controlled forever. By April, the quarters had learned the pattern. It was not spoken of openly. Nothing ever was. But women watched the house bell now with a different kind of attention, bodies tensing at its sound, hearts measuring the space between one ring and the next. Selection had always been part of plantation life. Who worked where, who was sold, who was punished, but this felt different. More intimate. More deliberate. Eleanor Whitcombe never appeared during these moments. She did not need to. Her will moved through others with quiet efficiency. Overseer Mills carried the list. He read names without inflection, as if announcing weather. Women stepped forward. Some cried softly. Some went rigid. Hannah learned quickly that stillness drew less attention than fear. The chosen women were not taken at random. Eleanor's ledger reflected her preferences with unsettling clarity. Ages between 16 and 25. No visible illness. Prior births counted as evidence, not warning. Wide hips. Straight backs. Strong teeth. The language was clinical, stripped of sentiment. She chooses like she's picking livestock, one woman whispered one night, voice barely audible beneath the churring insects. Hannah did not respond. She listened. In the small cabin near the tree line, preparation became ritual. Clean sheets. A basin of water. A lantern placed just so. The men came and went. Always at night. Always without explanation. What happened there passed into memory without description, because description offered no relief. What mattered was what followed. Weeks later, nausea came. Then fatigue. Then the quiet confirmation that needed no words. Women counted days in their heads, marking time by swelling bellies and missed cycles. No doctor was summoned. Eleanor required no confirmation she could not calculate herself. When Hannah realized she was with child, she felt nothing at first. Then anger. Then something like resolve. She began to remember everything. She remembered dates. Who came when. Who avoided her eyes afterward. She remembered Eleanor's shoes passing through the yard one afternoon, stopping briefly, turning slightly as if assessing from a distance. She knows, another woman murmured. She always knows. In the main house, the sons unraveled differently. Thomas withdrew into routine. He rose early, worked late, attended church with rigid regularity. He prayed for forgiveness he could not name. He prayed for absolution that never came. At night, he heard crying, not always from outside. Sometimes it came from within the walls, imagined but no less piercing. Caleb went the other way. He drank harder. He snapped at servants. He lashed out at Mills over small infractions, then apologized hours later with forced restraint. He avoided the ledger but could not avoid its consequences. Each marked page felt like an accusation he could not escape. "End this," he demanded one evening, cornering Eleanor in the study. "You have what you wanted." Eleanor did not look up from her writing. "I have begun. You are destroying us." She paused then just long enough to acknowledge the statement. Destruction implies loss without return. This is investment. Caleb laughed bitterly. "That is how you justify it to yourself?" "That is how I ensure survival," Eleanor replied. Outside, the plantation changed. Children were born into the quarters at an unusual rate. Their cries filled the air at night, a chorus that unsettled even those accustomed to birth and death. Eleanor inspected each infant within days, sometimes hours. She noted complexion, strength, vigor. She did not touch them more than necessary. "These are assets," she reminded herself, "not indulgences." But Thomas noticed something Eleanor did not. Some of the children had his eyes. Others bore Caleb's sharp chin, his restless gaze. The realization struck him one afternoon as he passed near the cabins and saw a toddler stumble forward, catch himself, then look up with a familiarity that made Thomas stop short. The child smiled. Thomas turned away abruptly, heart pounding. That night, he could not bring himself to eat. Anna watched too. She noticed how Eleanor's sons avoided certain paths through the quarters. How they quickened their steps. How they never lingered. She noticed how some children were moved quietly to different cabins, separated from mothers who asked no questions because questions only invited punishment. One evening, Hannah whispered to an older woman beside her, "She means to keep them." The woman shook her head. "She means to own them." By summer, the ledger was half full. Eleanor reviewed it each night, satisfaction tempered by calculation. Output exceeded projections. Losses remained minimal. She adjusted rations slightly, not out of kindness but necessity. What she did not record, what she could not quantify, was the way resentment curdled into something sharper, something patient. Hannah began to understand that survival alone was not enough. Memory was its own form of resistance. And somewhere between the house and the quarters, between ink and blood, the Whitcombe Plantation crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. None of them knew yet how it would end. But the land had begun to take notice. By late summer, the air over Whitcombe Plantation grew thick and sour, heavy with heat and the smell of ripe cotton left too long on the stalk. Thunderclouds gathered most afternoons, swelling and breaking without rain, as if even the sky could not decide whether to cleanse the land or abandon it. The first child was born in August. The labor began before dawn, the woman's cries muffled by cupped hands and clenched teeth. No midwife was summoned from beyond the plantation. There were older women in the quarters who knew what to do. There always had been. Birth, like death, was a familiar visitor. When the child finally came, slick and red and wailing, Eleanor was informed within the hour. She arrived without ceremony. The woman lay exhausted on her pallet, sweat-soaked and trembling, the infant pressed weakly against her chest. Eleanor stood over them, skirts immaculate, eyes sharp. She asked no questions about pain or fear. She did not offer congratulations. She asked only, "Is it healthy?" The answer satisfied her. Eleanor opened the ledger, dipped her pen and wrote a number. No name followed. That set the precedent. As the weeks passed, more births came, sometimes one a fortnight, sometimes two in the same night. The quarters filled with the sounds of infants crying, a thin, constant chorus that seeped into the fields and up to the main house. Mothers whispered names in private, clinging to them like talismans, but Eleanor never recorded them. Names complicated ownership. She preferred numbers. Thomas could not avoid the evidence forever. It appeared in small, devastating ways. A tiny sock left drying near a cabin. A child's laugh, his laugh, echoing unexpectedly from behind a woodpile. Once, he caught his reflection in a bucket of water beside a boy with the same pale eyes, the resemblance so stark it made him stagger. He retreated further inward. Caleb did not retreat. He hardened. "You enjoy this," he accused Eleanor one night, voice low and shaking. "You stand there counting them like trophies." Eleanor did not rise to the bait. "Enjoyment is irrelevant." "You are wrong," Caleb said. "You feel something. You must." Eleanor closed the ledger carefully. "What I feel does not matter. What matters is that the plantation prospers." Caleb laughed, sharp and broken. "You sound like the men you claim to outthink." Eleanor's eyes flicked up. "And yet they fail where I succeed." In the quarters, Hannah gave birth in early September. Her labor was long and difficult, her body racked with pain that stole her breath and her voice. When the child finally arrived, a girl, small but fierce, Hannah held her close, tears streaming silently down her face. She whispered a name no one else heard. Eleanor arrived before the sun rose. She inspected the infant with clinical efficiency, lifting the tiny chin, checking the limbs, listening for strength in the cry. Hannah watched every movement, her arms tightening instinctively. "Strong," Eleanor said. She wrote in the ledger. A number. Hannah felt something snap inside her then. Not loudly. Not visibly. But permanently. From that moment on, she watched everything. She noticed how Eleanor's inspections grew more frequent, more precise. How infants were sometimes removed from their mothers after only a few weeks, reassigned to different cabins to prevent attachment. How rations were adjusted subtly, just enough to sustain lactation without encouraging indulgence. She noticed how Thomas lingered near the edges of the quarter some evenings, pretending to examine fence posts or tools while his eyes followed the children with something like grief. She noticed how Caleb began to look at the ledger with open hatred. One afternoon, as thunder finally broke overhead and rain lashed the fields, a woman collapsed during labor. The child survived. The woman did not. Eleanor ordered the burial completed before nightfall. "No delay," she said. "Disease spreads when bodies linger." Thomas watched from the gallery as the small group moved toward the tree line with a wrapped form. He felt the weight of it settle into his chest, heavy and immovable. That night, he knocked on his mother's study door. "We cannot continue," he said when she allowed him in. "This will end badly." Eleanor regarded him with cool appraisal. "Everything ends. My concern is how." Outside, rain drummed against the windows. In the quarters, Hannah held her daughter and whispered stories she hoped the child would one day understand, not of freedom, which felt too distant to promise, but of memory. You must remember, she murmured, even if they try to make you forget. By autumn, the ledger was nearly full. Births had outpaced Eleanor's most optimistic projections. Profit margins soared. Word spread quietly among neighboring planters, admiration laced with something darker. What Eleanor did not calculate, what no ledger could contain, was the cumulative weight of so many lives reduced to ink and numbers. Pressure built in places she did not watch closely enough. Resentment fermented. Guilt curdled. Memory sharpened. And the plantation, once so orderly, began to hum with a tension that even the land itself seemed to feel, an unspoken warning carried on the wind. None of them yet understood that the most dangerous thing Eleanor Whitcombe had created was not the children. It was the silence. And silence, when stretched too far, always breaks. The death was not sudden. That was what unsettled Eleanor most. It came slowly, in stages, like a calculation that refused to resolve cleanly. The woman's name was Ruth. She was 19, slight-framed but strong, chosen early in Eleanor's planning for what the ledger described as consistent constitution. Her labor began at dusk, the air thick and unmoving, cicadas screaming as if trying to drown out what was happening inside the cabin. By midnight, the screaming stopped. That was when the older women knew something was wrong. Blood soaked through the bedding. Ruth's breaths came shallow and uneven, her eyes unfocused, lips tinged blue. The child had been delivered, alive, crying sharply into the night, but Ruth did not respond when the infant was placed against her chest. Someone ran to the main house. Eleanor arrived before dawn, lantern in hand, shoes barely touching the mud. She took in the scene at a glance. The blood, the slack body, the infant's thin wail. Her jaw tightened, not with grief but irritation. "How long?" she asked. "Since before midnight," one of the women said. Eleanor frowned. Time lost was risk accumulated. She knelt, placed 2 fingers against Ruth's neck, waited. Nothing. "She is gone," Eleanor said. "Wrap the body." Thomas stood in the doorway, having followed without realizing he was moving. The smell hit him first, iron and sweat and something sweet that made his stomach lurch. He looked at Ruth's face, slack and unrecognizable, and then at the child in the crook of another woman's arm. Something inside him broke open. "She was alive hours ago," he said, voice hoarse. "You could have sent for a doctor." Eleanor straightened slowly. A doctor would have asked questions. "She was a person," Thomas said. Eleanor turned to him then, truly looking at him for the first time that night. "She was an investment. One that failed." The words landed with lethal precision. Caleb arrived moments later, breathless, eyes wild. He took in the scene and let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "This is on you," he said, pointing at Eleanor. "This is what comes of your numbers." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Take him away." The burial was conducted before sunrise, just as Eleanor ordered. No marker. No prayer spoken aloud. The child was reassigned before nightfall. By morning, the plantation resumed its rhythm. Cotton was picked. Meals were cooked. The ledger was updated. But something had shifted. Thomas stopped eating altogether. He moved through the days hollow-eyed, barely speaking. At night, he dreamed of Ruth's face, of her eyes staring past him, accusing without words. He dreamed of children crying from inside walls he could not tear down. Caleb stopped pretending. He confronted Eleanor openly now, no longer careful with his tone. "You will kill them all," he said one afternoon, slamming the ledger shut. "And you will kill us with them." Eleanor met his fury with chilling calm. "Do not confuse inefficiency with inevitability." Caleb leaned close, voice low. "I will expose you." Eleanor did not flinch. "To whom?" "To the church. To the courts." Eleanor smiled thinly. "And you will explain your role?" Silence stretched between them. "What you do not understand," Eleanor continued, "is that the world is arranged to forgive men like you. But it does not forgive disorder. If this plantation falls, it will bury us all." Caleb stepped back, realization dawning. "You have trapped us." "I have protected us," Eleanor corrected. Down in the quarters, Hannah learned of Ruth's death before noon. The news spread quietly, grief passing hand to hand without sound. When Hannah looked at her daughter sleeping beside her, something cold and sharp settled in her chest. "She will not take you," Hannah whispered. "I will not let her." From that day on, Hannah began to plan, not escape, which felt impossible, but preservation. She memorized faces. She memorized numbers. She counted children and matched them to mothers in her mind, building a ledger Eleanor could never see. Meanwhile, Overseer Mills began to watch Eleanor more closely. He noticed the tension in the house, The arguments carried on too late into the night, the way Caleb rode out more frequently, returning with a look of reckless resolve. Mills understood leverage when he saw it. By October, whispers reached Montgomery. Not details, never details, but hints. Unusual birth rates. A death quietly buried. A widow running her plantation like a factory. Church elders came calling. Eleanor received them with composed grace, offered tea, spoke of God's will and the blessings of fertility. They left reassured if uneasy. What Eleanor did not see was the way Thomas watched from the hall, hands shaking as she spoke lies with the same precision she used to record truth. Nor did she see Caleb later that night, packing a small bag, his jaw set with something like resolve. He believed he could still stop this. He was wrong. The first death had not ended the system. It had proven its cost. And costs, once paid, only invited further debt. October brought cooler nights and a restlessness that settled into Whitcombe Plantation like a living thing. The cotton harvest neared its end, wagons creaked under heavy loads, and the quarters pulsed with a nervous energy that never fully slept. What had once been quiet compliance had shifted into watchfulness. The house felt it first. Thomas stopped attending dinner altogether. He claimed illness, then fatigue, then said nothing at all. He spent long hours walking the perimeter of the property, tracing fence lines that did not need inspection, lingering where the quarters met the fields. Sometimes he brought bread in his pockets, left it where small hands might find it before morning. He told himself it was penance. He told himself it meant something. One evening he heard a child crying near the woodpile. The sound snagged at him, thin and desperate. He moved toward it without thinking and found Hannah crouched low, rocking her daughter, her face streaked with sweat and fear. "She is burning," Hannah whispered. "She will not stop crying." Thomas knelt beside them, heart hammering. He touched the child's forehead, too warm. He glanced toward the house, then back at Hannah. "I will get help," he said. Hannah's eyes locked onto his. "Do not bring her." They both knew who she meant. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He fetched water, herbs he barely remembered from childhood, anything to ease the child's fever. It was not much. It was not enough. But by dawn, the crying softened into whimpers, and Hannah exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for days. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas said nothing. Gratitude felt undeserved. Caleb watched all of this with tightening resolve. He had begun to understand the shape of the trap Eleanor had built, not only around the women but around her sons. Each child born bound them further, their silence purchased with blood and inheritance. He began to meet Overseer Mills at odd hours, conversations low and guarded. "You know this cannot continue," Caleb said one night, voice barely above the wind. Mills shrugged. "Not my decision. It will ruin us." Mills's eyes flicked toward the house. Ruin is a matter of who speaks first. Caleb understood then what Mills wanted. Leverage. Mills had seen the ledger. He had carried out orders that made his stomach turn, but he had also learned the power of knowing too much. He began to hint, just enough, to suggest protection had a price. Eleanor sensed the shift. She noticed Mills lingering longer than necessary, noticed Caleb's absences, noticed Thomas's hollowed face. She adjusted her approach, tightening oversight, reminding each of them, subtly, precisely, of what stood to be lost. "People talk," she said one evening, standing at the window as the sun bled out over the fields. "They always do," Caleb replied. "They listen less," Eleanor said, "when there is no profit in hearing." In the quarters, the women spoke in fragments, shared looks, passed warnings like contraband. They knew which cabins to avoid at night, which paths to take when summoned. They began to shift children quietly, swapping sleeping places, confusing counts where they could. Hannah led these efforts without ever naming herself a leader. She remembered Ruth's face. She remembered the way Eleanor had said the word investment. One night, a fire burned low in the hearth of a cabin far from the house. Hannah whispered to the women gathered around her. "They count us with ink," she said. "We count ourselves with memory." Names were spoken softly, passed from mouth to ear, etched into minds that refused erasure. In the main house, Eleanor reviewed the ledger and frowned. The numbers no longer aligned perfectly. Small discrepancies appeared, nothing obvious, nothing provable. But Eleanor disliked irregularity. It suggested loss of control. She summoned Mills. "You will tighten discipline," she said. "There will be no deviation." Mills hesitated. "The women are tired." "Tiredness is irrelevant." Mills nodded, but his eyes betrayed calculation. That same night, Caleb packed his bag again. This time he did not tell himself lies about exposure. He knew better now. Instead, he planned distance, enough to breathe, enough to think. He believed that space might grant him courage he could not find under Eleanor's roof. Thomas found him in the stable, hands shaking as he tightened a strap. "Do not go," Thomas said. "I cannot stay. She will come after you." Caleb laughed softly. "She already has." They stood there a moment, brothers bound by blood and guilt, neither knowing how to save the other. Above them, in the darkened house, Eleanor stood at the landing, listening to the murmur of voices below. She did not move. She did not call out. She had anticipated resistance. She had not anticipated fracture. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke from a distant cabin where a lantern had tipped and been righted again. For a moment, the glow flared brighter than intended. Fire had always been a risk on plantations. What Eleanor did not know, what none of them yet knew, was how close the flame already was. The house had begun to crack. And once cracks appear, collapse follows in ways no ledger can predict. Caleb rode out before dawn, the sky still bruised purple over the fields, mist clinging low to the ground like breath held too long. He did not look back at the house. He had learned that looking back invited hesitation, and hesitation had become dangerous. He carried no papers, no proof, only memory. By mid-morning, Eleanor knew he was gone. She discovered it the way she discovered most things, indirectly, through absence. Caleb's place at the breakfast table sat untouched. His horse was missing from the stable. One of the smaller bags from the upstairs closet was gone. Eleanor said nothing. She finished her coffee. She closed her ledger. She rang the bell. "Send Mills to me." When the overseer arrived, hat in hand, Eleanor watched him closely. "My son has left the plantation." Mills nodded. "I saw him ride out." "You will see to it that he does not travel far," Eleanor said, "and that he does not speak." Mills hesitated only a fraction of a second. "To whom?" Eleanor's gaze hardened. "To anyone." Mills understood the weight of the instruction. He also understood the opportunity. He left the house already calculating. Caleb reached Montgomery by nightfall. He did not go to the church. He did not go to the courts. He went instead to a man he believed might listen, a distant cousin with political ambitions and a fondness for scandal. "You do not understand," Caleb said, pacing the small office. "This is not rumor. It is systematic." The cousin leaned back, hands folded. "And your role?" Caleb froze. "I did not." "You did," the man said gently. "Whether you wish to claim it or not." The silence that followed was worse than Eleanor's threats. By the time Caleb left the office, he understood the depth of his isolation. Truth required witnesses willing to stand with you. He had none. That night Mills found him. The encounter was brief. No raised voices. No struggle anyone later admitted to seeing. Caleb was last spotted riding west toward the river. By morning, his horse was found wandering without him. Eleanor accepted the report with a single nod. "Accidents happen," she said. Thomas did not believe it. He searched the tree line himself, ignoring Eleanor's orders to remain in the house. He found nothing, no body, no sign of struggle. Only a torn strap caught on a low branch, darkened with something he did not want to identify. Grief hit him like a delayed blow. He collapsed against a tree, breath ragged, hands clawing at bark. Caleb had been reckless, angry, but he had been alive. And now, Eleanor watched Thomas from the veranda, her face unreadable. "You will not speak of this," she told him that night. "You had him killed," Thomas said, voice hollow. "I preserved this family," Eleanor replied. "You will thank me one day." Down in the quarters, the women sensed the shift immediately. Men whispered. Overseer Mills grew harsher, his temper sharpened by whatever bargain he believed he had struck. The house felt heavier, more watchful. Hannah heard of Caleb's disappearance from a driver who had overheard talk near the stables. "One of hers," he said quietly. "Gone." Hannah held her daughter tighter. She understood then that Eleanor would not hesitate to erase anyone who threatened the system. Son or slave, it made no difference. That night, Hannah began to plan something bolder than memory. She began to think of fire. In the main house, Eleanor returned to her ledger and crossed out a name. Caleb Whitcombe. No explanation followed. No notation of loss. Just a line drawn with steady ink. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was order restored. But as she closed the book, her hand lingered on the cover longer than usual. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across her face. It passed quickly. By morning, the plantation resumed its rhythm. But beneath the surface, betrayal had changed its shape. Caleb's absence did not end resistance. It sharpened it. And somewhere between the quarters and the house, a decision was forming, one that would not be written in any ledger. The night would come soon enough. And with it, consequences Eleanor Whitcombe could no longer contain. The night it happened, the wind shifted without warning. All day the air had been still, oppressive, pressing sweat from skin and patience from tempers. By dusk, clouds gathered low and fast, swallowing the moon before it could rise. When the wind finally came, it came sharp and sudden, rattling shutters and carrying sparks farther than they had any right to travel. Hannah felt it first. She stood outside her cabin, her daughter strapped tightly against her chest, watching the lantern light flicker inside the small structure near the tree line. The one Eleanor used for sickness, for isolation, for things that needed to be kept quiet. Overseer Mills had ordered a woman there that afternoon. No one had seen her since. Hannah's hands trembled as she tightened the cloth around her child. "This is the night," she whispered. She did not act alone. She never had. While Eleanor believed control flowed downward in clean lines, resistance moved sideways, through glances, through pauses, through shared breath. When the first flame caught, it was not an explosion but a careful beginning. A tipped lantern. A breath held. Fire licked along dry wood, hesitant at first, then hungry. By the time the alarm was raised, the wind had done its work. Flames leapt from the cabin roof to the nearby shed, sparks riding the gusts toward the east wing of the main house. Bells rang wildly. Shouts split the dark. Thomas was the first from the house. He ran barefoot across the yard, the heat already biting at his skin. Smoke burned his lungs, but he did not slow. He knew where the children were kept. He had counted them himself in his head too many nights to forget. "Get them out," he shouted to anyone who would listen. In the quarters, chaos erupted. Women grabbed children, stumbling into the dark, coughing, crying, praying. Some ran toward the fields. Others toward the river. No one waited for permission. Eleanor emerged onto the gallery moments later, her face illuminated by firelight. For a brief instant, she stood frozen, not in fear but calculation. She watched the flames spread, gauging damage, measuring loss. "Mills?" she called. He did not answer. The east wing caught fully then, flames roaring as dry beams surrendered. Smoke poured upward, choking and thick. Eleanor moved at last, descending the stairs with rigid determination. "This is not random," she said aloud, as if naming it might restore order. Inside the burning wing, a door jammed. Thomas heard the cries before he saw the smoke seeping through the frame. He slammed his shoulder against it once, twice, a third time before the wood gave way. Heat rushed out, blistering his skin. Inside, two children huddled in the corner, eyes wide, faces streaked with soot. He scooped them up without thinking, wrapping them in his shirt, and ran. As he emerged, he saw Eleanor near the steps, her dress singed at the hem. "The ledger," she said. "The ledger must be saved." Thomas stared at her, disbelief cutting through the adrenaline. "People are inside." "Those numbers are proof," Eleanor snapped. "Without them." "They are children," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "They are alive." For the first time, Eleanor looked at him not as a son or a tool, but as an obstacle. "Go," she said coldly. "Do not interfere." Thomas hesitated only a second. Then he turned away from her. Above them the roof groaned. In the quarters, Hannah ran toward the river, smoke trailing behind her like a shadow. She did not look back. She counted steps, breaths, heartbeats. Around her, others fled, the plantation dissolving into motion and sound. Somewhere near the stables, a beam collapsed, sending sparks skyward. Mills was seen briefly near the flames, shouting orders, then not at all. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, the fire had burned itself out. The east wing lay in blackened ruin. 2 outbuildings were gone entirely. Several cabins smoldered, half-standing. The fields were scarred but intact. Bodies were counted quietly. Some were never found. Eleanor stood amid the wreckage, ash clinging to her skirts, her face pale and set. The ledger was gone. Thomas approached her, exhaustion dragging at every step. "It is over," he said. Eleanor looked at the ruins, then at him. "Nothing is over," she replied. But her voice lacked conviction. In the days that followed, officials arrived late and left early. Statements were taken. Explanations offered. The fire was declared accidental. Records were sealed. No one asked why the birth numbers had been so high. No one asked about Caleb. The plantation resumed a version of itself, diminished and altered. Hannah was never found. Neither was Mills. Years later, Thomas would remember the night of fire as the moment he finally understood what Eleanor had built and what it had cost. The flames had not destroyed the system. They had exposed it. And exposure, once ignited, never truly dies. In the weeks that followed the fire, Whitcombe Plantation existed in a state of uneasy quiet, like a body that had lost blood and learned too late how vital it had been. The east wing remained a charred skeleton, its blackened beams jutting skyward like broken ribs. Eleanor refused to have it rebuilt. "Let it stand," she said. "Ruins remind people what happens when order fails." Officials from Montgomery arrived 3 days after the fire. They walked the grounds with practiced disinterest, boots crunching over ash, notebooks filling with half-truths Eleanor supplied calmly and without hesitation. She spoke of faulty lanterns, of careless hands, of tragedy without intent. No one asked about the ledger. Those who might have noticed its absence were the same men who had benefited from its existence. Silence, like cotton, was a shared commodity. Thomas gave his statement last. His voice did not shake, but his eyes never lifted from the ground. "I was asleep," he said. "I woke to shouting." The men nodded, satisfied. By the end of the month, Whitcombe Plantation was officially cleared of wrongdoing. No charges. No inquiries. No records requested beyond those Eleanor herself provided. What could not be erased was the change in the quarters. The women moved differently now, more guarded, more deliberate. Children were kept closer, watched with an intensity born of hard-earned knowledge. They had seen the house burn. They had seen the system falter, even briefly. That memory mattered. Some children were quietly sold south that winter. Others remained. Eleanor adjusted operations again, slower now, more cautious. Births continued, but without the former precision. Something essential had been lost in the fire. Control. Thomas announced his departure in January. "I am leaving Alabama," he said, standing in the parlor where his father had died. "I will not return." Eleanor regarded him for a long moment. "You will regret abandoning what is yours." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "It was never mine." He left with little more than clothing and a small sum Eleanor allowed him, not out of kindness but calculation. Let him go. Let him become a footnote rather than a liability. They never saw each other again. Eleanor lived another 13 years. She never remarried. She never rebuilt the East Wing. She continued to manage Whitcombe Plantation with diminished influence, her reputation quietly altered. People still respected her. Some feared her. But admiration had curdled into caution. She died in 1860, months before Alabama seceded. Her estate was divided among distant relatives who found the plantation more burden than boon. Within 5 years, it was abandoned entirely, swallowed by debt and war. As for Hannah, stories persisted. Some said she reached the river that night and followed it north, trading labor for shelter, memory for survival. Others claimed she died in the chaos, her body lost to smoke and water. Years later, a woman matching her description was seen in Ohio, working in a free black community, teaching children to read names that had once been denied to them. Whether those stories were true or wishful thinking, no one could say for certain. What survived was memory. Decades later, after the war had ended and slavery had been declared abolished, fragments of an unmarked ledger surfaced in a county archive, singed pages misfiled, overlooked. Historians debated their meaning. Some dismissed them as exaggeration. Others recognized patterns too precise to ignore. Numbers without names. Births without mercy. A plantation that had treated human life as arithmetic. The Whitcombe story was never taught in schools. It appeared only in footnotes, in whispers, in the gaps between official narratives. But those gaps spoke volumes. Because systems like Eleanor Whitcomb's did not vanish with her death. They adapted. They hid. They learned new language. And the children born under her roof, those who survived, carried her legacy in their blood, whether they knew it or not. History did not forget them. It merely waited. For someone willing to look past the ledgers and listen to what the silence had been hiding all along. Years after Whitcombe Plantation vanished beneath vines and collapsing roofs, people in Alabama still lowered their voices when the land was mentioned. They did not speak of Eleanor Whitcombe directly. They spoke instead of bad soil. Of a place where nothing grew right. Of nights when fireflies gathered too thick along the tree line, blinking like signals meant for someone who never arrived. Records from the county courthouse told a neat story. A prosperous widow. An unfortunate fire. Decline brought on by war and poor management. Nothing more. Nothing worth reopening. But history is rarely written by those who lived inside it. Thomas Whitcombe died in 1873 in Ohio, far from cotton fields and ledgers. He never married. He never owned land. He worked as a clerk, quiet and meticulous, known for correcting numbers no one else noticed. In his personal effects, discovered after his death, was a small bundle of papers tied with twine. Inside were names, dozens of them, written carefully, lovingly, as if the act of recording them might grant some measure of dignity long denied. No explanation accompanied the list. Only dates. Eleanor Whitcombe left no such papers. Her personal correspondence was burned by relatives eager to sanitize the family name. What remained was official, impersonal, scrubbed clean. But absence can be evidence too. And historians who later studied the fragments of the singed ledger noticed patterns that defied coincidence. Anomalous birth rates. Unusual lineage overlaps. Children sold south whose parentage did not align with recorded pairings. When cross-referenced with estate documents, the truth emerged slowly, reluctantly, like a wound reopening decades too late. A system had existed. Not rumor. Not madness. Not exaggeration. A system. One built by a woman who understood that slavery was not sustained by cruelty alone, but by structure. By compliance. By silence enforced through profit and fear. Eleanor Whitcombe had not been an aberration. She had been an optimizer. And that was the most disturbing truth of all. As for Hannah, no document ever bore her name. But oral histories collected after the war spoke of a woman who arrived from the South with a child wrapped tight against her chest, who insisted that names mattered, who corrected anyone who tried to shorten or replace them. She used to say, one descendant recalled, that forgetting was another kind of chain. Whether Hannah survived the fire or not, her resistance did. It lived on in memory, in whispered stories, in children taught to remember who they were even when the world told them they were numbers. Whitcombe Plantation returned to forest eventually. The fields collapsed into wild growth. The cabins rotted. The main house caved in on itself, the veranda splintering and sinking into the soil it had once profited from so mercilessly. But the land did not forget. And neither should we. Because Eleanor Whitcombe was not remembered as a monster in her time. She was respected, admired, protected. Her system functioned precisely because it aligned with the values of the world around her. That is how atrocities endure, not through chaos but through order, through ledgers, through silence, through people who look away because the numbers still add up. So when we tell stories like this, we are not excavating the past for spectacle. We are tracing the blueprint of how cruelty disguises itself as efficiency. How systems outlive the hands that built them. How history buries what it is not ready to face. And how, sometimes, the only resistance left is remembrance. What do you think? Was Eleanor Whitcombe a singular evil, or merely a product of a system that rewarded her for doing exactly what she did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story unsettling, disturbing, or impossible to forget, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows for more dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented truth and buried horror. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who believes history is finished telling its secrets. These stories were hidden for a reason. These voices were silenced on purpose. And remembering them is the first step toward understanding what we are capable of becoming. See you in the next story.